Hello, I'm Mr. Matthews, and today I'm going to be sharing my entire collection for the Nintendo GameCube, which is, outside of the NES of course, my favorite video game console. But I did want to have a bit more fun with it than your typical collection video, so I figured I'd make this more of an anecdotal exploration of the system itself. The hardware, the weird accessories, the music, the memories, and of course, the collection. This is the GameCube as I experienced it. During the 32-bit generation, my interest in video games was at an all-time low. Even at the time, I was not entirely sold on these flashy new consoles or their weird, janky, angular graphics. I always felt that for as much of a technical step forward as these new systems were, in terms of gameplay, they were a couple steps backwards. So even though I owned a PlayStation, most of my time with it was spent playing and looking for games that were more like the games that I enjoyed from the previous generations. Also, it is worth mentioning that the entirety of the 32-bit generation took place during my last few years of high school and my first few years as a young adult in the real world. So it's fair to say that I had other priorities, and video games in general just took a distant backseat. When I bought the GameCube in 2003, my tumultuous younger years were starting to fall behind me. I had a bit more free time and disposable income to work with, and I also found that the growing pains from the previous generation had started to work themselves out. So the GameCube was the first modern console that I was able to fully appreciate for what it was, and I would absolutely say it reinvigorated my interest in video games. Now, there were three standout games and/or series that really defined and sold the GameCube for me, and I'm going to be talking about each one during the course of this video. But for now, I'm going to be talking about the first one, which is the first GameCube game I ever played. And holy crap, what a game it was. Metroid Prime is actually the main game that I originally bought the GameCube for, and to this day it's one of my absolute favorite games on the console. Now at first glance this may look like a run-of-the-mill first-person shooter, but make no mistake, this is a Metroid experience every bit as definitive as Super Metroid. It just so happens to be in first person. Up until this point, the Metroid series had been exclusively side-scrolling and very, very platform-heavy. Platforming mechanics in 3D games are notoriously difficult to pull off well, especially in first-person games. I don't know how Nintendo and Retro Studios pulled it off, but Metroid Prime is just as platform-centric as the other games in the series, and it works almost perfectly. I could gush for hours about the beautifully crafted world that's a joy to explore, and the wonderfully weird and atmospheric soundtrack. However, I can find fault with any game, and if I had to kick the tires a bit, I would say that Metroid Prime falls a bit flat at the end, with an unnecessarily tedious fetch quest that seems to serve no other purpose than to stop the game dead in its tracks. This nitpick aside, the majority of Metroid Prime is so perfectly designed that I still rank this as one of my favorite games of the Metroid series and an absolute must-own for any GameCube library. I did not think much of it when I first played it. But nowadays, I'm of the opinion that Metroid Prime 2 is superior to the original Prime game, despite the fact that I have a longer list of criticisms about the game. The impeccable aesthetics, music, and controls return from the first game, although they don't have the same wow factor the second time around. The story is also a bit more elaborate, which isn't saying much since there was virtually no story in Prime 1. Prime 2 also introduces Dark Samus, who is more than just the shadow version of Samus Aran. She's actually the title character of the series. Now, if you remember, Metroid Prime was the name of the final boss in the first game. At the end of the battle, Metroid Prime steals Samus's Phazon suit. Phazon, by the way, is the toxic, radioactive material that the Metroid species thrives on. So Dark Samus is Metroid Prime, although this detail seems to have been buried in the broader scope of this game. Now, I have issues with the awkward controls for the new play mechanics in this game, and with the uninspired design of the bosses. But my biggest complaint with Prime 2 is that it double and triples down on the fetch quests that plagued the end of the first game. However, I am a sucker for effective atmosphere and mood, and Metroid Prime 2 absolutely drips with it. The palpable sense of isolation and dread are so perfectly realized and so engaging that despite my initial reservations and standing criticisms, I still have to concede that Metroid Prime 2 is an overall better game than the original. I just don't like it nearly as much. Now, why do you suppose the GameCube had a handle? I suppose it does make it a little easier to pick up with one hand. Now, to my knowledge, Nintendo has not officially explained the lunchbox design of the GameCube. And unless they have, I just don't know about it. It doesn't matter, because I do have a theory. But for that, we gotta go back to the N64. The fact that the N64 had 4 controller ports was a huge selling point, and I'm sure that Nintendo knew that it would be well received. However, I don't think that even Nintendo themselves knew how much this would turn the N64 into a monster party console. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I think if Nintendo had known in advance how well traveled the N64 would be, how often it would be taken from one house to another for the sake of multiplayer, they probably would have put a handle on this one too. Now, realistically, the fact that the GameCube has a handle does not make it any easier to carry all this stuff across town to your friend's house. But the subliminal effectiveness of design cannot be understated, and everything about the GameCube, from its compact, travel-friendly size, to the inviting placement of its controller ports front and center on the console, and yes, even the handle itself, are meant to reinforce the idea that just like the N64 before it, the GameCube is meant to be enjoyed with friends. Here's a handful of games with a focus on multiplayer, played by myself. Star Fox Assault is what you call a mixed bag. On one hand, it's a very nice looking game. It sounds fantastic, and controlling the R-Wing feels as good as it ever did, assuming of course you like the other Star Fox games. The problem is that way too often, the game pulls you out of the cockpit of the R-Wing and drops you into a mundane on-foot mission. And it's here that Star Fox Assault becomes little more than a super generic third-person action game. In fact, of the 10 stages in this game, only 3 of them are crafted classic-style R-Wing stages. The rest are all arena-based, free-roaming maps where your only objective is to destroy all the targets. The reason for this is that Star Fox Assault was originally planned to be a multiplayer-only game, basically a beefy evolution of the multiplayer mode from Star Fox 64. The story elements and presumably the flight stages were added later in the game's development. However, just adding a few admittedly excellent flight stages to an otherwise subpar game isn't enough to completely save it from mediocrity. It's a decently fun game in its own right, but still a far cry from the true follow-up to Star Fox 64 that I've been waiting for. Now, as long as we're talking about multiplayer games, here's an interesting one. Now, this game came with 2 discs, one of which is Pac-Man World 2, which, whatever, it's a 3D platformer starring Pac-Man. But the second disc is where the real meat of this package is. Pac-Man Versus is a multiplayer-only game developed by Nintendo as a proof of concept for the new Game Boy Advance link cable, which essentially creates a data connection between the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube console. The link cable connects the GBA to the 4th controller port on the GameCube, and up to 3 other people use the remaining ports with standard controllers. And then you all just play Pac-Man. The player with the Game Boy is Pac-Man, and only they can see the entire maze. The other players play as the ghosts, and only have a limited view of the maze on the television screen. And this game uses standard tag rules. The first ghost to capture Pac-Man wins the round, and assumes the role of Pac-Man during the next game. Nintendo used this concept again on Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures. Now, this is predominantly a single-player experience, but 1 to 3 other people can link up for some cooperative gameplay, providing of course that each player has a Game Boy Advance and a link cable of their own. Now, obviously, these aren't the only games that utilize the link cable. I'm sure there are plenty of other games that utilize the link cable in fantastic, innovative, and mind-blowing ways. But remember that this is a collection video first and foremost. I can only show what I have. Which is a shame, because that means I won't be able to talk about the second game in my trifecta of standout GameCube titles. Resident Evil 4. Now, this was and is an amazing game. And it actually was exclusive to the GameCube for a minute. And now since then, of course, Capcom has re-released this on virtually every other console that has come out since then, and I have all those versions. The only one I'm missing is the GameCube version. Now, Capcom famously showed the N64 very little support, but they more than made up for it with the amount of games that they lavished upon the GameCube. Now, here are some of the games that Capcom released on the GameCube, either as a developer or just as a publisher. Now I'm gonna stop and talk about this one real quick, not because I especially like this game, but because this is the closest the GameCube got to having an original, classic-style Mega Man game. Network transmission takes place immediately after the events of the first Battle Network game on the Game Boy Advance, and it attempts to meld the collectible battle chip power-up mechanics of the Battle Network series with the traditional side-scrolling gameplay from the classic Mega Man games. The problem is it does neither of these especially well. It does have an excellent soundtrack though. If you were a die-hard fan of the classic Mega Man games, Capcom still had you covered. Now, as big of a Mega Man fan as I am, the first time I played through a lot of the games in the original series was right here on the Mega Man Anniversary Collection. This is a very solid compilation of the first 8 Mega Man games, with some kind of interesting unlockables. My only real complaint about this game, and it's a big one, is that the controls are reversed, with no way to change them in the options. If you're used to the controls of the original games, this might just be a deal breaker for you. The Wii's Virtual Console gets a lot of credit for kicking off the retro video game craze, and honestly, that's probably pretty accurate. But for me personally, these retro game compilations on the GameCube are what reignited my own interest in classic video games. I can't help but notice that you've been admiring my GameCube travel bag. And to answer your question, no, I don't travel with the GameCube. I suppose if you want to pack up all your GameCube stuff and take it to grandma's house, this would probably do the trick, but I mainly use it as overflow for my Game Boy collection. These are the various sports games that I still have clamshell cases for, and I will most likely never play. Now, of course, I'm not here to talk about Game Boy games today, but it does remind me that there's something else the GameCube can do. The Game Boy player adapter connects to the bottom of the GameCube and essentially turns the system into a consoleized Game Boy Advance. It does require the startup disc to operate though, which unfortunately is a bit harder to find than the base adapter itself. So it would definitely be a good idea to pick up a spare set for cheap if you have the opportunity to do so. Go! The Game Boy player doesn't just play Game Boy Advance games though. It'll also play original Game Boy games, Game Boy Color games, go! Pretty much any game or peripheral that would also work on the original Game Boy Advance. Speaking of weird adapters, I also have this thing, which is the DK Bongo Controller, which as far as I know only works on these 3 games, none of which I own. Kinda neat, I guess. I'm not sure why you'd ever use something like this though when the stock GameCube controller was so perfect. The controller is probably one of the GameCube's best features. It looks a little strange with the ununiform button size and shape, but this is quite possibly one of the most comfortable controllers I've ever used. It just melts into my hands. Now, how do you improve on near perfection? Well, you make it wireless. The GameCube was the only console of its generation to have a first-party wireless controller, which for some reason they called the Wavebird. Now, in my opinion, this is every bit as comfortable as the standard GameCube controller, and the wireless function does not require line of sight, which was a very big deal at the time. My only complaint with the GameCube controller is with the tiny and awkwardly placed D-pad, which is weird because making really good D-pads is kind of Nintendo's thing. Now, the saving grace is that not many games use this for anything important. However, it does become an issue when you're trying to play Game Boy games. A better option is to use the link cable to connect a Game Boy Advance to the console, which will allow you to use that as a controller. Now, my GameCube collection isn't huge. I have been focusing more on quality over quantity. That being said, I have picked up a lot of inexpensive games over the years, and they can't all be winners. So here is a handful of games that I either haven't played enough or don't like enough to be able to say anything other than I own it. In what could best be described as a strategy pinball game, in Odama you have to manage traditional pinball table gameplay while simultaneously trying to guide your army from one end of the screen to the other by shouting orders at them using the included GameCube microphone. And this is about as fun as it sounds. Game developers, please don't do stuff like this. Now, in contrast to the last selection of games, here are some of the more noteworthy titles in my collection. The more harder to find games, or my personal recommendations. Starting with this one. Now, I could have easily talked about this in my multiplayer focused games, but I decided to talk about it here. I'm funny like that. If you still pine for the charmingly sluggish and clunky gameplay of GoldenEye on the N64, you will probably like this game. The developer Free Radical was founded by a bunch of former Rare employees, which is probably why Time Splitters looks and plays like an unofficial sequel to GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. Now this is a funny little game from Behemoth, the developer who would later go on to make the excellent Castle Crashers. Now if you're unfamiliar with this game, it gets compared a lot to Contra, but in my opinion it's much more like the Metal Slug series. And if you are somehow unfamiliar with Metal Slug, it's kind of like Contra. And I've saved the best for last, the final game in the trinity of GameCube games that really defined the system for me. And you've probably already guessed what this game is, just based on what you haven't seen yet. What, did you really think it was gonna be Smash Brothers? Now here's the thing, I like strategy games, especially when there's some kind of resource management, resource gathering aspect involved. I also like games that are a little weird. And I also have a bit of a soft spot for cute games. Pikmin is all of the above. You play as Captain Olimar, who has crash landed on an alien planet and has to recover all the missing pieces of his spaceship. He has to complete this mission within 30 days, because that's how long it'll take for his air supply to run out and he'll die. To do this, he enlists the aid of the Pikmin. These disarmingly adorable creatures will help out not only by carrying the parts back to the ship, but also by savagely attacking the other bizarre life forms on this suspiciously Earth-like planet. There are 3 types of Pikmin and they all have their own uses. The red Pikmin are the bruisers, they do the most damage. The yellow Pikmin are light and can be thrown extra high, and the blue Pikmin have gills and can breathe underwater. Each Pikmin type has a secondary ability as well. The red Pikmin are resistant to fire, the yellow Pikmin can carry bombs, and the blue Pikmin, well, not drowning in the water is a pretty useful attribute, so that's really the only unique ability they have. The main thing you're gonna need to come to grips with is the high turnover rate in your Pikmin army. As cute as they are, the Pikmin are honestly born to die, and despite your best efforts to keep them alive, they'll meet their ends in a variety of ways, including being crushed, burned, blown up, drowned, or eaten by any number of the weird creatures roaming the planet's surface. And every time they die, it's heartbreaking. Pikmin 2 improves on the original in pretty much every way. Olimar returns to the Pikmin's world to collect garbage, which as it turns out is a hot commodity on his home planet. he is joined by a second character this time, Louie, and the two characters can travel together, or you can split them up and switch between them at will. In theory, this increases your productivity as each character can have his own squad of Pikmin. The 30-day time limit is gone, so now you can take as long as you need to gather up all the treasure that is literally littered all over this planet. Most of your time will be spent exploring the various caverns that are scattered across each of the levels, and it's here that the two new types of Pikmin can be discovered. By tossing members of your Pikmin army into these purple and white flowers, you can evolve them into either the giant purple Pikmin, each one of these is as strong as 10 regular Pikmin, or the tiny white Pikmin, who can find and dig up hidden items and are also poisonous, so they do damage to the enemies who eat them. The treasure collecting aspect of Pikmin 2 was a standout feature for me. It was a lot of fun seeing the variety of familiar items that lay in wait beneath the planet's surface. And that was my entire GameCube collection. Obviously, it's not a complete collection. I'm fully aware that there are some key titles that I'm missing, and I'll probably pick those up at some point in the future. But right now, it's safe to say that my most prolific period of collecting is pretty much behind me. So let me know in the comments what you think about the GameCube. What are some of your favorite games or memories, and maybe even some not so obvious games that you would recommend. And until next time, thank you very much for watching. I'm Mr. Matthews. Goodbye.